Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the Anvil Center. For those of you who are visiting us for the first time, I should say who I am. My name is Patrick Johnstone. I am the mayor of New Westminster for almost a year now. So I still feel like I still have that new mayor smell. I still feel very nervous standing in front of people and introducing myself that way. But yeah, I am here just to give you a bit of introductory remarks and to welcome Jim, the main attraction today. I do want to welcome everybody to the Anvil Center. For those who are visiting us for the first time, I hope you start thinking about making this building part of your regular schedule. This is a space that was built, it was meant to be a place that pulls the community together through both the gallery space, the archives, and the museum space, the incredible world-renowned new media gallery over there. When I say gallery space, and I also mean the small community gallery spaces that are around where people in the community who are just learning or just finding ways to share their art in the community are able to display their art here. There's also great programming spaces upstairs in the Anvil where residents of all ages can hone and learn new skills or learn new practices or just find their artistic outlets. So I hope you'll find an opportunity to come here more than once and see what's going on here. I also want to recognize and acknowledge that New Westminster is on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Halkha Milam speaking peoples. In the city of New Westminster, we're learning and we are beginning to, in a better way, acknowledge the people whose lands we're on, recognizing that the lands we're on, the people of this land were separated from the land and their stories were separated from this land, not by accident, not by happenstance, but by intent and by the forces of colonialism. The city of New Westminster this year is engaging in a year of truth. What that means for us is we're spending a lot of time this year sharing the deeper truth of what New Westminster is, being a 160-year-old city, being perhaps the beachhead of colonialism in this part of North America, and a place that has a much deeper history than just as a city. It has a deeper history as a place where colonialism really had harms in this. And so we are, through this year of truth, trying to dig deeper into that history and share it with the community so it can better inform our conversation about reconciliation going forward. I encourage everybody, if they have an opportunity, to go to yearoftruth.ca, which is the city's website, which has on it some of the reports that have talked about the deep history of this city, but it also talks about some of the work we've done over the last 20 years on reconciliation. Some good steps and some perhaps missteps that we've made, but I think it's important for us to bring all those out and have those conversations about that when we do talk about reconciliation in New Westminster. So we're here about connections and conversations. Those words, both of those words are vital and part of the word community. In this council term, the City Council has included community connection as one of our strategic priorities, along with housing and infrastructure and transportation and things like that. We see in New Westminster that community connection is actually, it's not about just the physical linkages in our city that connect us. It's about the spiritual, the personal interconnections in the community that make us a city. When we were talking back at the beginning of this term, before we did our strategic planning, we were all knocking on doors around the city asking people to vote for us, and we're talking to the community about what's important to them about New Westminster, and it always came back to that theme. It's like people in New Westminster feel connected. They feel like it's a small town where people know their neighbors, which is really unusual in this big, vastly growing and vastly changing metropolitan area. And that community connection is something that is really important to New Westminster, but we also recognize it's very friable. And it's something that we lost a lot of opportunities to foster through COVID. And unfortunately, social media is not going to help us put it back together. We have to find other ways to put it back together in our community to make sure that people feel connected to their neighbors, connected to their community. So we have made that a priority in the city. And that involves a lot of things for a city. It involves empowering organizations in our community that are already doing that work. It means recognizing what those organizations are and what organizations need us to get out of their way and what organizations need us to help them, because they don't all need the same thing. And part of it is also having conversations like this, having discussions with the community about what does being a neighbor mean to you, and what does being connected to your neighbors mean to you, and what are the things that are stopping you from feeling that connection. to your neighbors. So yeah, like I said, it also means leading I've gone way off my script, so I have a tendency to do that. It also means leading discussions like this, where someone who has expertise in community building, like Jim Diers, can inspire and inform us about the work that we all need to do as a community to value and support connection. So I don't want to give Jim a long introduction. I want Jim to introduce himself, but I do want to thank Jim for coming to New Westminster to provide his insight. I'd also want to thank you all for showing up here to talk about your community. I'd also encourage you after this to provide some feedback. If you go to special events or just email special events at newwestcity.ca, to our special events website, you can provide feedback on what you liked about this talk series or what you didn't like, or anything you think that we need to have deeper conversations with in the community. We're trying to learn from you what we actually need. What you need to hear from us and what you need to hear from each other as we do this work. So I'd encourage you to go to that, send an email, and provide us some comments afterwards, whether you like today's event or not. And other than that, I'm going to thank you all for showing up and giving us the gift of your time and your attention today. And I would like to welcome Jim Diers to come up here and talk about community connections.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Mayor. Hi, everybody. Yeah, it's great to be back in New West. It's really great. I love this city for lots of reasons. You know, the history, the historic buildings, the riverfront, the this place. And I saw the exhibit out here. It's just powerful about people with learned experience from homelessness. Really, check it out if you haven't. But just all the things that happen here. And to have such a diverse population in this city and progressive city means a lot to me. So it's great to be here, really great to be here. Second reason I'm glad to be in New West is I was born in Burnaby, very close, so I get to be close to my birthplace. Third reason is yesterday I got to celebrate two holidays. It was Indigenous Peoples Day in Seattle, and then I spent the rest of the day celebrating Thanksgiving here. So very seldom you get two holidays in one. And the fourth reason is, and probably the most important, definitely the most important reason, is because this is a place that understands the importance of community. I can't think of any other city that has made community belonging and connections one of their strategic priorities. Most cities are just focused on what they can do, how they can deliver services, and forget about the social fabric of our community. So kudos to you. Tomorrow I'm doing a workshop for the city employees, sharing tools that they can use to actually help realize some of those goals around connectedness and community building. But I'm especially thankful for you being here today, because while the city can provide some tools, only you can build community. City can't build relationships for you. You have to do that work yourselves. So what I want to do this afternoon is talk about why I think there's nothing more important than community right now. I know we have lots of issues facing us, but I think the key is building community, building those connections. And I'll talk about why I think that's so important. And then secondly, I want to share some of the lessons I've learned and some of the tools I've learned about how we can build community, we can really build inclusive community, okay? Make sure everybody's part of our community. But before I do that, I want to just talk about what community means to me, so we're all on the same page. Because sometimes we use that word community pretty loosely. Sometimes we talk about community as the place where we live. I like to think about our neighborhood as the place where we live, but community is really about our social relationships. Community is a group of people who identify with and support one another. There's all kinds of communities. There's communities of identity, there's communities of interest, but I'm particularly focused on communities of place. A neighborhood is the place with which we identify. And while there are all kinds of different kinds of communities, I think in many ways our places provide the key ingredients we need to build really strong, inclusive places, communities. So here's the potential of neighborhoods. This is a map of Seattle, and in Seattle we have over 100 neighborhoods. People really have a strong sense of neighborhood. Neighborhood usually has a business district at its center. A neighborhood often has its own elementary school, often with the same name as the neighborhood. It has its own unique housing characteristics. It often is defined by, it has a natural area or park that's at its center, maybe a city facility like a library. It's often defined by arterials, by its topography, but very distinct sense of place. And so our neighborhoods provide a key ingredient for community, which is a common identity. If we're going to have a sense of community, we all need to feel like we belong to something that we have in common. And what we have in common is our neighborhood. When I first moved to Seattle, we lived in the Wallingford neighborhood. We were so proud of the neighborhood, we put it in neon lights at the top of the grocery store. Second thing that's critical for building a sense of community is a manageable scale. There's no way you can build a sense of community in Seattle. It's way too big, 800,000 people. No way you can feel connected with each other. No way you can get to know each other. And same with New West. New West is way too big to build a sense of community. You need to do it at a more local level in your neighborhood. Third thing is critical for building a sense of community are community gathering places. I like to call them bumping places because community is all about building relationships. And you build relationships by bumping into the same people over and over and over again. So if you want to build community, you need places to bump into other people. And the closer those bumping places are to where you live, the more likely you will to bump into the same people over and over and over again. So you need the coffee shop, right? You need the skate park. You need the pocket park. You need the basketball court. You need the pub. All those places, the library, those places where people see the same people over and over again. The grocery store, right? I'm sorry? Church, yeah. We could go on and on about bumping places. Yeah. Fourth is opportunities for collective action. Ways for people to do things collectively that they can't do by themselves. And I tend to find the closer you involve people to where they live, the more likely they are to get engaged. So again, our neighborhoods provide an opportunity to build community. Fifth is opportunities for placemaking. And this is unique to neighborhood, place-based communities where you can actually shape the environment where you live. And probably the most important one for me is the opportunity to create inclusive community. If you think about it, every other kind of community is one kind of people. A community defined by their interest or their identity. It might be a cultural community. It might be a religious community. It might be a political community. It might be a community defined by age or defined by ability or defined by all kinds of things, interests, right? Different hobbies, whatever. But it tends to bring in all the same kind of people. And I think that's a problem in our society, where people are coming together around, who have shared identity. And we're missing out on the people who are different than ourselves. It's a huge issue in the States now with increasing polarization. And people are suspicious of people who are unlike themselves. And I think our neighborhoods is an opportunity to bring diverse people together, because it's the one kind of community where you have people with differences living in the same place. It might be differences of income. It might be different sexes. It might be different religions. It might be different politics. It might be different interests. But they're all together in the same place, and it's the opportunity to create inclusive community. So there's two tools for meeting people's needs. One of those tools is community, which I've described. The other is agencies. I call them agencies. Sometimes we call them institutions. But agencies are organizations dependent on paid employees, right? So it's City Hall, city government. It's schools. It's the police. It's the healthcare system. It's nonprofit organizations, not-for-profit organizations, all of which tend to be led by staff, paid staff. And there's nothing wrong with that. We need good agencies, but we also need strong communities. But they have very different relationship to each other. Agencies provide services. Communities provide care. Agencies have different classes of people. We have professionals. We have the volunteers. We have the clients. In community, we're just all citizens in the largest sense of the word. Agencies tend to operate in a top-down fashion, whereas communities tend to be more democratic. Agencies tend to focus on people's needs, where communities focus on people's gifts. Agencies tend to be one way, whereas communities are all about reciprocity and mutual support. Agencies tend to be siloed, whereas communities, everything comes together. You get a more holistic perspective. And agencies are totally dependent on money, right? And the city workers are committed, but they might not show up if they're not getting paid, right? Whereas communities totally dependent on trust and relationships. And again, I'm not valuing one over the other. They're both absolutely critical, but they play different roles. What I want to emphasize is the power of community. The things communities can do that you can't have agencies substitute for. The communities have a key role to play that no agency can substitute for that role. And the first one is power to care for the earth. I'm getting really worried about climate change. And I don't think we're going to make it. If it's just about green technology, people have to actually adopt it. We need to change the way we live. And I don't think that's going to happen unless people feel some sense of connection with each other. Otherwise, what difference does it make if I don't recycle? What difference does it make if I guzzle gas? I'm just one person on this large planet. It won't make any difference. But it's in community we feel some sense of responsibility, some sense of accountability, and some sense that collectively our actions will make a difference. You know, the whole environmental movement, the whole Earth Day thing started bottom up. We absolutely need community if we're going to make change. So I want to share a story about the power of community when it comes to caring for the earth. This is from the Ballard neighborhood in Seattle, sort of the near north side of Seattle. This particular story is based on a program we developed in Seattle when I was director of the Department of Neighborhoods for the city of Seattle. And we called it the Neighborhood Matching Fund. It's still operating. But through that fund, the city provides cash as a match for the community's equal match of volunteer labor in support of community self-help projects. There have been more than 5,000 projects that have been completed so far, and I'll just describe one of them here. There was a woman in Ballard who said, you know, the problem in Ballard is we have the neighborhood with the least number of street trees and the least amount of open space of any neighborhood in Seattle. I want to change that. She was passionate about trees. She wanted to see trees up and down the streets of Ballard. So she posted notices in her church bulletin. She put them in the corner grocery store. She got them in the Ballard News Tribune, the local paper, advertising for other people who shared her passion for street trees. And she tried to find somebody at every block in Ballard who shared her passion. And if nobody came forward, she'd go to that block and knock on every door until she convinced somebody they shared her passion for street trees. And then she invited those people to come to a training about how to plant and take care of the trees. And then those block captains trained their neighbors about how to do the same thing. She turned in all of her the signatures of people who had volunteered for this project with her matching fund application. And one day, trucks came into her neighborhood with 1,080 trees. They dropped them off at every block in Ballard. DeVilla knocked on the door of the block captain and said, the trees are here. The block captain knocked on the neighbors' doors. That day, over 1,000 people came out and planted trees up and down the streets of Ballard. People felt incredibly empowered. Beginning of the day, there were no street trees. The end of the day, they had tree-lined streets. Look what we can do when we work together as a community. Well, they went on from that and said, you know, we still have lots of problems. We still have the least number of parks. They had this old vacant lot that was a crime-ridden area right next to a grocery store in the business district, and they said, let's turn that into a green natural area again. So volunteers came together that created Baker Park, all with native plants. A local artist who was Native American created this totem in the middle of the park. And it shows a bear with a frog in his mouth, kind of a symbol of returning nature to the city. This group went on the next year and said, we've got asphalt around our elementary school. Let's take out the asphalt and make it green so the water can actually percolate through the ground rather than having instant runoff. Called it a Gray to Green project. First time it had ever been done. And here they are celebrating the completion of their project, all done by volunteers. The local marching band's playing. They're called the Sedentary Sousa Band. It's the only marching band I know that actually plays by sitting down. And now we do Gray to Green at all of our schools. It's kind of innovation that only comes out of community. This is a street end that was never developed because it's too steep. Cars could never make it to the top. But it was owned by our transportation department, but it wasn't good for transportation, so it just sat there neglected, became a problem. It became overgrown, was attracting rats. The only thing that tried to get up there were four-wheel drive vehicles. They come in the middle of the night, challenge each other, race their engines to see who can make it to the top. Driving the neighbors totally crazy. I thought the neighbors were crazy because they went out with picks and shovels and dug through that heavy hard-pan clay soil by hand, hauled these timbers up the side, terraced that whole hillside, and turned it into a community garden. This is now one of 120 community gardens we have in the city of Seattle, all built by neighbors. This is one of the most recent projects. This is the site of a former house. So to commemorate the house, they built all the furniture out of cement. But here they are celebrating the completion of that project. And they showed a timeline showing the 20 projects they built over 20 years, all with volunteers. They built a salmon estuary. They built all kinds of green areas. And then each summer, they have a sustainable Ballard Fest. And they have music and food to bring people in. They have booths to educate neighbors about what they can do to reduce their climate footprint. And the first booth he goes to is the undriver's license station, where you check all the ways you will not drive over the next month. And when you do, you get a laminated undriver's license. It looks just like my official Washington State driver's license. Julia Fields, the one who organized it, she says, I'm going to walk, I'm going to bike, I'm going to take transit, et cetera, et cetera. And when you get your undriver's license, it entitles you to drive the shuttle bus. This is going down the streets of Ballard, and it gets everybody's attention, gets people thinking, what could I do to get out of my car? What could I do to reduce my carbon footprint? This created a movement. All the neighborhoods around Ballard started organizing their own all-volunteer sustainability groups. There are now 67 of these organizations, and collectively they call themselves SCALLOPs, Sustainable Communities All Over Puget Sound. And it all started with Dervilla Gowan and those street trees. There is incredible untapped potential in our communities. Second key power of community is the power to care for one another. Again, agencies can provide services, but only communities can provide care. Free care that's given 24/7. I was working with the Toronto Community Housing. It's the largest affordable housing developer in Canada. And met some amazing people. So there on the top floor of one of the high-rise apartments was a community garden. And what was cool was people weren't growing food for themselves, they were growing it for their neighbors who needed it. This was another group, a tenants association in one of the high-rises. And they'd put together an after-school program, all volunteer to support each other's kids after school and support the families. And they built this wonderful playground themselves. And this guy was the president of the association. And they had somebody on every floor of the apartment building who was a member of their board, whose job it was to listen to people on their floor, to find out what the issues were, to help make connections. Their job was to welcome new people onto the floor of this apartment building. And they also set up a system of buddies, so that people who needed a buddy, an older person who needed some support, a young person who needed somebody to watch them after school, everybody could have buddies within. All done by community. Third is the power to prevent crime. Again, we need agencies, we do need police to enforce laws, but only communities can prevent crime. We spend way too many resources, particularly in the States, lining up the ambulances at the bottom of the cliff, when community's job is to build the fence at the top. We spend more and more and more money on so-called public safety programs. People aren't feeling any more safe. We have more and more people behind bars, and people aren't feeling any more safe. We've forgotten the role of community. This is in our Soda neighborhood, industrial area south of downtown. Mike Parringer was concerned because the backs of the warehouses have been covered with graffiti. And this is where our light rail comes through, and it sent a really negative message to everybody coming into Seattle. All they saw was graffiti and garbage. So Mike put together a program where he got artists he got our court system to say, hey, kids who get busted for graffiti can have an alternative sentence where they can help us create murals for the backs of these warehouses that have been covered with graffiti. And they got mentored by other professional artists. And together they made hundreds of murals on the backs of these and beautifying this industrial area. And we found that as long as the kids were involved in this program, not one of them reoffended. Another unique power of community is the power to respond to natural disasters. Both Christchurch and Kobe are sister cities of Seattle, so you probably don't want to be our sister. As you probably know, both places were hit with major earthquakes. The mayor of Christchurch told me that the number one lesson they learned from the earthquakes was the best way to prepare for emergencies is get to know your neighbors. Because when that earthquake came, there weren't enough emergency crews to get beyond the central city. There were places where people, even if they had crews, they couldn't get to because the infrastructure was toast. In emergencies, we're totally dependent on our neighbors, but we often realize when it's too late. I was invited to Lismore, Australia, to do a workshop with them about recovering from disaster because Lismore had faced a horrendous flooding. And we're trying to figure out how to rebuild. So here's the city council person on the right-hand side, Eddie Lloyd, is the person who invited me, and we became Facebook friends. 5 years later, I was looking at my Facebook, and this post came up from Eddie. The rain just won't stop. We have not had a break in rain for hours and hours. My brain can't fathom the gravity of tragedy from this flood. All our animals are dead. My heart is breaking for Lismore. We're up 15 meters up in the loft, but only 1 meter left until the water reaches us. I called the state emergency services, so we'll wait, but we have our canoes if we need to get away. Here they are on top of their house. But a neighbor came with a boat and saved them and 100 other families. And now they formed a group to work for climate change because they're realizing they can't go through this every 3-5 years, but they also realize the importance of community. Another unique power of community is the power to promote health. This is where I live now on Vashon Island, an island just off of Seattle. It's a 20-minute ferry ride, but it's a world away. It's a largely rural community. When the pandemic hit, as the mayor said, it was tough to build the relationships. But I tell you, I've never valued community more than I did during that pandemic. It was my community that got me through that pandemic. We'd already organized into neighborhood groups. We have over 200 neighborhood groups on the island that have self-organized to prepare for an earthquake, because we know an earthquake's coming at some point. And somebody in every neighborhood has been trained about how to provide emergency medical support. And also what else we need to do emergency plans. So each neighborhood's put together their emergency plan, finding out who's got the generator, who's got the skills. So we have a plan for what we're going to do in the case of an earthquake. And we get to practice this all the time because we're always having power outages with windstorms, and the trees come down and take out our electricity. So we get together and we make stone soup out of all our food that's thawing in our freezers, and we make stone soup together. And we just support each other to help us get through crises. So when the pandemic came, we were ready. We knew who needed help. We knew who was isolated, who would have a hard time getting to the store. We knew who needed a ride to the doctor. So here, delivering the toilet paper and the eggs to somebody who we knew needed that support. People put up little free pantries. Volunteers came together to cook meals and take them to seniors who used to come to the senior center for their food, and to take them to the kids and their families who no longer had the free lunch programs, no longer had the free breakfast programs because school wasn't operating. We raised money so that low-income people could get fresh bucks to buy food at the local farmers' stalls that are all around the island, so they get fresh organic produce. And then we said we need masks, and there weren't any masks left. All the masks had gone to what we could find, went to healthcare providers. So people on the island volunteered to make masks, and they were beautiful masks. 85 people got involved in this, and they delivered masks to every one of our houses. But it's one thing to get masks, another one to get people to use them. So we had people on the island who started up a marketing campaign and put up posters around the island. We put up signs at the ferry. Artists got involved. This woman created this. See her up at the top? Get your attention right off the ferry. Encouraging visitors came to island to mask up and watch out for us because we don't have any hospital on the island. They just had fun with it and created gigantic masks for the van. Just things to get people making that part of our culture. Not through edicts, but just we care about each other. We're going to support each other. And then we really didn't have the medical staff, so we tried to figure out how do we do the COVID tests. And they came up with a really low-tech way to do it where we didn't need fancy P2P equipment. We could just get volunteers to do it themselves. It became, the New York Times wrote it up, and it's now being used in all kinds of rural communities. But then we had to encourage people to actually take the test. So here they dressed up to encourage, at the major intersection, to encourage people to get tested. And then volunteers ran the testing station. Then they created a vaccination station, all built by volunteers. And they were staffing it in all kinds of weather. We have lots of artists on the island, so we started up a fund to help support artists who were having a hard time making it through. And in turn, they made art. They made this wonderful mural for the island. We have lots of musicians on the island. They started doing what they call the quarantine sessions, where we had online concerts that were available free of charge, just to keep people's spirits up, to get us through that pandemic. We do lots of parades on Vashon, and we realized we can't do parades because everybody would gather downtown. So somebody came up with an ingenious idea and says, why don't we bring the parade to the people? So this parade went all over the island, and people could watch from their own houses. Oh, this is our, we don't have a real mayor on Vashon. We're part of King County, but we have an unofficial mayor. And we have a vote every year on who's going to be our unofficial mayor. And the way you vote is you put money into a slot for your favorite nonprofit. And so we have people running as candidates for from those nonprofits. And it's just like any other election, right? Whoever gets the most money wins. Well, not exactly, but... so here, this is the goat that won this year. We have a goat for mayor. Our library closed during COVID. And, you know, people just were eager to read and stay in touch. We had lots of time to read. So somebody had this old Japanese fire engine and fix it up as a bookmobile. Just neighbors coming together to do this, driving all over the island, delivering books to people. Our theater, we have the wonderful community theater that had closed, and we're trying to figure out how do we do films. And people had a great idea and says, back of the warehouse, let's paint a gigantic screen, we'll make a drive-in theater. Our athletic club had to close, and people said, how do we exercise? How do we stay fit? Somebody had a great idea. So let's put our treadmills on the beach. where we can be socially distanced and not being closed. We still do that. It's so much fun. This guy, Doug, he was trying to figure out how he could contribute. Somebody with disabilities. Well, his family, neighbors supported him to start up a flower delivery business. And Doug delivers flowers to people who are grieving because they lost somebody to COVID. He delivers flowers to people who are isolated and have no connections. He delivers flowers to people who headed up the project to make the masks, the people who volunteered on the for the vaccines. Delivers flowers to all those people. And as he comes to the door, his biggest gift is his smile. And he just delivers the flowers and a smile, and it helps so many people get through that pandemic. And I'll talk about that more later, how every one of us has gifts to give to our community. And that's really the basis for building community. Then the power to create great places. I thought I should have a story from Canada. So this is from the Newton neighborhood in Surrey. And in Newton, they had, right in the center of Newton, they have these huge trees. And it's kind of dark in there, so it's creating some public safety issues. People were concerned there was drug dealing going on. There were concerns about it. And so they contacted the RCMP. And they came through and did a CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design process. And they said, the problem is these trees, we need to clear cut them. And the neighbor said, don't you dare. That's something we prize. So all volunteer group came together, and they put up a sign, true community safety is only possible when neighbors know each other. The problem isn't the trees, the problem is a lack of community. So we're going to use these trees as a way to build community. So they put up a sign when they opened up saying, welcome to the Grove. Look left for buses, look inside for happiness. And they found really clever ways to use these trees. They put up welcome signs in all the different languages of this very diverse neighborhood. They said, we just need to put some lighting up at night so people feel safe because it's really dark in here. That would take care of it. The city did a study and said, it's going to cost $20,000. We can't afford it. And so the community said, well, how about if we just put up Christmas lights? Just cost a fraction of that, and it really works. Kids love it because they have a natural place to play right in the middle of the city. This is a tree that had come down, and the stump, they created a chessboard. They just have all kinds of fun. They created a tightrope between the trees. They created a village in the trees. The library had some encyclopedias that were out of date. They were going to take them to the dump, so the community built Encyclopedia House. Had a hard time getting it through the building code, but yeah. They have all kinds of workshops there. This is a workshop on seed bombing. This is the bollards that keep cars from coming through, and they're always dressing them up. They have so much fun with the trees. Here they just use chalk to make them beautify the trunks. There's lots of musicians in the neighborhood, so this is the place where they come together to do music. They have a free piano. They create the poetry. You can rearrange the words to create poems on the side of the tree. Here's one of the poems that came out of the poetry group. And they formed a group called the Cedar Bark Poets Gathering. And when I was there, they were releasing the 3rd volume of poetry that's come out of the Grove. They have all kinds of events at the Grove. This is a blessing ceremony at the beginning where they're doing the smudging to bless the property. This is the Remembrance Day. They even celebrate Groundhog's Day. But I love this is the regular side. Park regulations, no dumping, no littering, closed, dusted on. The community sign says, park suggestions. Don't be mean, smile at others, say hello. And look how it's brought people in, diverse from all walks of life. The key is in how do we get certain people out of our communities, how do we bring everybody in and get a better understanding of one another. Margaret Wheatley summed it up really well. Whatever the question, community is the answer. It's not just true with the things I've talked about, but it also is the key to strengthening democracy. People aren't getting involved in democracy if they aren't involved with each other, if they don't have some sense of connection. And then advancing social justice. No major social change in my country has ever come top down. I think the same is probably true here. Our civil rights movement, women's rights movement, the disability rights movement, the gay lesbian rights movement, the peace movement, the environmental movement. Every major change has come bottom up. So without strong communities, we can't make change. So I've shared a bunch of stories, but what I really, and stories can be powerful because they can inspire us. They can give us ideas about what we might do ourselves. But oftentimes when I share these stories, people are going to say, well, that's nice, Jim. That's, you're doing some great things in Seattle, but we aren't Seattle. We're different. We're New West. I know that the same things are happening here. I'm sure there's great stories of community. So what I'd love to do is hear a story, a local story. Who here has experienced the power of community? Who here has a story they could share, a local story, that would remind us that this happens absolutely everywhere? Hate to put everybody in, oh, already we have some stories here. Could we we'll get the mic up to you. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. I would like to share my story as new resident of New Westminster. I had an opportunity to work with the city of New West and do a project with LGBTQ community. So we had a lot of new immigrants coming from Afghanistan and not knowing a lot about the LGBTQ community. Myself, as the community member, wanted to stand up and provide information about the laws in Canada and how they can be friendly and respectful to the LGBTQ community. So, yeah.
All right, thank you. That's so powerful. We'll talk about that a little bit more. I talked about the divisions we have and about how oftentimes when we form communities of interest or communities of identity, we get prejudices about each. We don't know people who are different. And I think it was incredible to me the huge shift we made around sort of gay marriage and people recognizing the rights. And I think that happened because people who are gay, lesbian came out of the closet. And we started realizing those aren't like these strange people. They're our kids. They're our coworkers. They're our neighbors. And we got to know them. And it's really hard to stereotype people when you know them, when you have a relationship with them. And I find that's true across all kinds of differences. Thanks, that's a powerful story. Other stories? Yeah, thanks.
Megan up there is my neighbor, and a group of mums came together. A woman in the community put a post up on a local moms group looking for other mums who are experiencing grief around climate change and what that means for our kids. So we came together with a few other mums from our neighborhood and had a good collective cry about what our kids are going to experience, but then through that and our kids playing and having it be a space that was welcome for families, we were able to move through that grief into action. And so we started doing workshops in the community, family-friendly climate events. We would go to the marches. We would take our kids down to meet folks who were setting up shop along the river to oppose different projects. And really started reaching out and trying to engage families in climate action because not all of us have the privilege of, tying ourselves to a tree or whatever it might be. We've got kids at home, and any advocacy and activism looks different with a family. So that group was really active. The pandemic kind of put a damper on it, but we did a lot of great advocacy to City Hall too, and we were engaged in advocating for the 7 bold steps for climate action that the city did. And so it really came full circle when last year, I think, the city recognized Babies for Climate Action, which was the group that we started with an award for the work that we had done with the city. And then from that, there was a whole bunch of other groups. North Van started a Babies for Climate Action. Vancouver started a group. And so it sort of like trickled out.
Thanks for a great story, and thanks for what you do. I'm having grandsons now, and I got 4 of them, and it just nothing gets you focused like that. Thanks. Any others? Yeah. Oh God, we got all kinds of stories here.
About 10 years ago, the hospice facility in New Westminster shut down. So there was no hospice in the city. So an association called the New West Hospice Association filled the gap by getting volunteers to help people who wanted to die at home. And we would provide services for them and try to get their neighbors and friends to work together. We built it on the work of Alan Kelleher, who wrote books about the Compassionate City, and the city of New Westminster has been instrumental in helping that happen. So there is a deep history of New Westminster being a compassionate city and helping the New West Hospice, without a building, support people who are dying at home.
Others? I suppose no other. That's great. I was hoping we'd get a story or two. There's incredible community here.
I am just going to mention the wonderful relationship between agency and community, courtesy of our mayor and the city of New West through the senior center here. Because there is anti-discriminatory laws that don't permit any of you, allow everyone to come in and enjoy our over 30 activities that are coordinated and planned by our volunteers. I'd like to invite all of you to join us because it's sparingly probably funded by the city of New West, but it is actually a community of over 3,000 people that make the activities work, and it has the benefit of health, mental health, physical health, and of course socialization, as well as that wonderful support system that we have. Thank you.
That's great. You said over 30? It
could be anybody.
Oh, good. I could qualify. Yeah. Very cool. That's great. I love that. We're all getting older.
I'm working with Community Action Network.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
I love that.
When I was just like, I was a newcomer like about 5 years ago, and I was welcomed. I as a refugee, as a mother, as a single mother. Then after that, through the CAN Action Network, I was given the work as a black person who have been so discriminated. My kids was so bullied in schools. Then they didn't realize that my only son was the only one black kid in the same class. That was the reason as to why. So through my son raising the voice of being a black person, then they realized that in class they have to mix the white and the black kids. And after that, this is the voice that I've raised into so many schools, and we're working with the school board. And also, I just love the way that the city, they're working with us as a CAN, Community Action Network. Through their help, they have helped a lot of moms. One of them, just getting into so many parents, single parents, and that is it. We're just so happy, like, to be commuting with the community, bridging the community, and also the city of New Westminster. We really appreciate that.
Thanks for what you do. That exhibit out there is so powerful. And you're right. Sometimes it's there's things we can do as community, but one of the things we can do is also advocate for change, right?
Hi, my name is Monica Deng. I'm a Community Action Network. City of New West is the one supporting us. We're having a small group. They call it New Immigrant Parents, because our kid in the school, they just abusing them. Sometimes they take the kid. There is some kid, they said, oh, you have to kiss my shoes and all these things for the kid. We just, all immigrants, they just come together, the mothers and fathers. We said we have to do something. We have to be included in the system of the school. because a lot of our kids, they do suicide and all these things. We come with this thing. We just started last year, and we are going ahead with that thing. We are a small group, and city of New West, we have some people from the city too in the city. I'm so grateful with our mayor. He's not giving us for us, he's just supporting us for everything we are doing it.
Great.
Thank you so much, and God bless you.
Well, any others? Oh, okay. Let's do this one last one here, and then I got to get on and talk about what we can do to do more of this.
We used to have serious disempowerment of people in New West, in the Brow of the Hill neighborhood where I lived. I had a friend named Kamiko Karpov. She called me King of the Brow. I called her Bishop of the Brow. We kind of took care of things. But we had a problem. Our neighborhood was very disempowered. Politicians didn't bother to campaign. Tenants issues weren't addressed by anyone. And we had about 20% people in that neighborhood show up to vote in a federal or provincial election. I think 4% in a civic. So we started a voter registration drive. And we took 3 years of a voter registration drive. We convinced Elections BC to set up a table at every food bank day to register people to vote. We had the churches in the neighborhood set up tables to register people to vote. And when that wasn't enough, we got Elections BC to give us the forms to just hand out to people. And we organized people to go into their buildings and get people to vote. So our aim was to increase the vote over 20%, enough that politicians might feel like they have to take our neighborhood seriously. And in the 2004 election, we had a lot of people who couldn't afford ID and who were worried about voting. So we said, go vote at St. Barnabas Church. We will have volunteers there. We will make sure that you're able to vote. And on election day in 2004, our MP, Peter Julian, got elected with a 200-vote majority. In our neighborhood, the vote increased from 20% to 50% in one election. And I have to tell you, it was a beautiful sight. I went down to St. Barnabas Church to make sure they were doing it right, and people were lined up to vote. At a church that sometimes got a dozen people show up, they were lined up to vote outside of the church, to the end of the block, to the end of the next block, and down the alleyway to the end of the next block. But once people felt empowered, they were determined to vote, and that created an actual election result in the election of a member of parliament. And our city hall, almost right away, wanted to meet with the residents association and the churches. Within a month, we had an event with our city leaders that we could not have had before. So.
Wow, there's a lot going on. One of the key tools for building community is to just share those stories. We need to find new ways to get those stories out, because a lot of the things people kind of take for granted, they don't know what had happened, how the hospice program came about, why people are all of a sudden voting, why policies in schools are changing. We need to get those stories out to remind people about the power they have, because people are feeling so disempowered these days, and to realize the power of coming together as a community. So we talked about the power of community. The bad news is our communities are in crisis. Maybe not so much in New West, although I'm guessing there's a lot of people who aren't in this room who don't feel so connected with community. All kinds of things. Robert Putnam, professor at Harvard, wrote a book called Bowling Alone. And he talked about how the strength of our society was our strong communities, and how people came together in associations to do things together that they couldn't do individually. But he talked about how over the last 50 years, incredible breakdown of community. And he documents how fewer and fewer people belong to the traditional associations, like the bowling league, right? So he calls his book Bowling Alone. It talks about how fewer and fewer people are voting, how fewer and fewer families are eating dinner together. All kinds of indicators of the breakdown of community. He cites a few reasons. I've added a lot of my own. Single-purpose land use. It used to be we'd live, learn, work, and play all in the same neighborhood, in the same village. And now we've created single-purpose places. We might live in one place. We might drive a half hour to shop somewhere else. We might commute an hour somewhere else to work. We might go to a large community center that's, again, a long ways from our neighborhood. In a way, we have many different communities, but in a sense, no community at all, because we don't bump into the same people over and over again. Increased mobility. It used to be generation after generation, our families would live in the same village. And now most of us have moved multiple times over the course of our life. How many people here have moved more than 5 times over the course of your life? And when you're always on the move, it's hard to build community, because community is all about relationships. More time working. People spending more and more, working longer and longer hours, spending more time commuting to work. Prejudice, talked about a little bit already. People organizing into communities that are defined by interest and identity rather than by place. Fear is a key thing breaking down community in many places. Whether or not people have a reason to be afraid, they look at the newspaper, they watch TV, and all they see are these accounts of crime and violence, and they're afraid to come out of their house. And the more they're afraid, and the fewer relationships they build, the more they become afraid. Sort of fear of the unknown. Electronic screens of all types that are breaking down our community, where people are communicating virtually rather than face-to-face. I do some Facebook, and I saw a cartoon on Facebook once with 2 people in the funeral parlor, and they're sitting there in front of the casket. And one turns to the other and says, "I don't understand why more people aren't here. He has 2,000 friends on Facebook." Friends are only friends if they're going to be there for you. Neoliberalism. We're giving incentives for self-interest rather than for the common good. Globalization, where decisions and products are made further and further away from where we live. And some of the most disturbing things to me is that the very agencies that are trying to help our communities are inadvertently contributing to the very breakdown of the very communities they're trying to help. Where we have more and more and more professionals doing for community what community often did better for themselves. And again, it's not that we don't need professionals. There is definitely a need for professionals to do things communities don't do so well. But so oftentimes we have professionals usurping the role of things communities do best. I often find that the strongest communities are in those kind of rural, small towns. They tend to be in the places with the fewest agencies trying to help, is where you have the strongest community. And then specialization. Agencies tend to be organized in silos, around their very narrow focus of their mission, around a very narrow client base. So we have one silo for old people. We have one for young people. We've got one for new citizens. We have one for people with disabilities. And you can't organize communities in silos. It's in communities everybody has to come together. So everything's backwards. It's like our communities having to organize themselves the way the professionals are organized, rather than professionals organizing the way our communities are organized by place. And as a result, we have an incredible epidemic of loneliness. Almost half of British Columbians say they sometimes feel lonely. 1 in 5 Metro Vancouver residents doesn't know a neighbor well enough to ask for help. And that was before the pandemic. 23% of Metro Vancouver residents spend more time alone than they would like. And it's not just an issue for older people, it's an issue for young people. 30% of 18 to 24-year-olds experience loneliness often or almost always. And it's got incredible consequences for the individual. The research shows that loneliness is worse for our health than not exercising, as harmful as being an alcoholic, and twice as harmful as being obese. Statistically, loneliness is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And as I've talked about, the impacts aren't just on that lonely person, they're on our whole society. Because without strong communities, without inclusive community, we can't address the other issues that we face. We can't realize the real power of community. I've done some work in China and Taiwan, and there I was reminded that the Chinese word for crisis is made up of two characters, one meaning danger and the other meaning opportunity. So the good news is, with every danger, there's incredible opportunity. And the other good news is, we have lots of opportunity right now because we're facing multiple crises. The crisis of climate change, the crisis of inequality, where the gap between the rich and the poor is getting larger and larger, the crisis of intolerance, the crisis of our democracy, where not only do we have fewer people voting, but people thinking of themselves as ratepayers or taxpayers rather than as citizens. The good news is, and the opportunity is, Amanda Abrams identified it, in a world where the social fabric seems to be rapidly fraying, the economy is uncertain, the future of the planet is at risk, is there a better way to hit the reset button than to come back to the neighborhood level and begin to genuinely rely on one another again? So I want to talk about how do we do that, okay? Yeah. Really, there's nothing more important right now. So the keys to connecting neighbors. The first key, I have a friend in Calgary, Cesar Cala, and he said, Jim, the problem getting people involved in community are those GD activists. I said, GD? What are you talking about? He said, the grim and determined. And it cracked me up because it describes so many of the self-proclaimed community leaders I know in Seattle who are always negative. They love to complain. And they're so darn serious all the time. And they've forgotten that the key to building community is we need to have fun. Yeah, we need to be serious, but we also need to have fun. Who's going to get engaged? Who's going to want to follow somebody who's always sour, right? So here's some examples of communities that have learned how to have fun. This is in Elgin, Illinois. I was doing a workshop there, and they took me on a walking tour around the neighborhood, and I saw this gigantic blue wooden tulip in front of somebody's house. And I said, that's kind of weird. What's the story? And they said, there's this guy who collects junk. He can't help himself. He collects more and more junk. And then his wife gets on his case and makes him take all this junk back to the dump. But every time he returns from the dump, he's got more junk than when he left. One time he went, some of you know this guy, I think. One time he went and he found this gigantic blue wooden tulip. He says, man, that is too good to let go to waste. So he brought it back home, he planted it in his front yard, and he told all the neighbors, come over Friday night, I'm having a blue tulip party. Neighbors are all scratching their heads because nobody had ever heard of a blue tulip party before, but they were curious, so they came by. They had the best time. There was a barbecue. The kids had formed a band. People were dancing. They had so much fun that next Friday night, that blue tulip showed up in front of somebody else's house. And that blue tulip now has been traveling around the city of Elgin for years. Every Friday, showing up in front of somebody else's house. And all week long, the neighbors are walking around trying to figure out, where's that blue tulip going to be this week? It's built community like nothing else could have because it's fun, it's engaging. This is in our Beacon Hill neighborhood of Seattle, largely single-family residents, but right in the middle is this high-rise for low-income seniors. And the people who lived in this high-rise, there's a security system on the building so that nobody from the neighborhood can get in, and people in the high-rise are afraid to go out because they don't know anybody in the neighborhood. So you got two distinct communities of people in the same neighborhood. One of the residents had an idea. He used to work for the Boeing company. He was passionate about airplanes. He invited the neighbors up to the top floor. They took the security system off on one Saturday afternoon, and they went up to the community room at the top floor. The neighbors were eager to get up there because they'd never seen the neighborhood from that high up before. And there was coffee and Kool-Aid and cookies, but he taught everybody how to make paper airplanes. And then they took those paper airplanes and flew them out of the window at the top floor of this tower. And there was a contest about whose plane could go the furthest. And then they got prizes. But in the process, they met each other. They built relationships so that the people on the inside had people on the outside that they could go and visit. So people on the outside had people they could contact to get inside to build those relationships. This is in downtown Tacoma. More and more people started living downtown, but pedestrians weren't feeling very safe. It was very auto-oriented. They couldn't get the attention of the city officials, so in the middle of the night, they started painting their own crosswalks. And they painted them all over the city. And the city got upset and took power washers to get rid of those crosswalks. But the next night, more showed up. And the city said, it's actually illegal to paint crosswalks. You could get fined for this. So they started creating things that look like crosswalks. They were just polka dots and other things. Finally, the city gave up and said, what are we going to do about pedestrian safety downtown? They called a big meeting and put up $500,000 for pedestrian improvements downtown. Sometimes fun is also serious business about making change. Second part of getting people engaged is the importance of starting where people are. This is absolutely critical. I was trained as a community organizer by Saul Alinsky. Said, if you want to get people engaged, you need to start where they're at. Not where you're at, but where they're at. And so there's several levels to this. The first one is start where they live. Start on their block or in their building if it's a high rise, or their floor if it's a really high rise. Because the closer you involve people to where they live, the more likely they are to get engaged, right? If it's a citywide gathering in New West like this, you're probably going to get more people than you would in your neighborhood. You're probably going to get more people in your neighborhood than you would on a particular block in your neighborhood. But you're never going to get as high a percentage of participation as if you involve people right on the block where they live, right? Because if I don't get involved, who's going to do it? If I don't get involved, my neighbor's going to know I'm not, and I'm going to be in trouble, right? Childcare is easier. Transportation is easier. You're going to see the immediate benefits from your participation. So again, involve people close to where they live. This is standard. Oftentimes we bring people together around block watch or neighborhood watch to watch out for crime. This is my grandson. But we're watching out for problems in the neighborhood. I actually think that's the worst way to bring people together. You don't gain security by watching out for strangers and locking yourself up in your house. You gain security by getting to know your neighbors, by building connections. So in New Zealand, they don't call it block watch, they call it neighborhood support. And it's about supporting each other around whatever the needs are in the neighborhood to build those relationships. And then you find people are a lot safer. In Shreveport, they call it community renewal. And you sign a pledge saying, I'm going to care for my neighbors. And now more than 50,000 people have signed those pledges, and they've organized their blocks around shared care. In Edmonton, they started up a program called Block Connectors that's sponsored by the city, where they train neighborhood volunteers how to be block connectors, where they have conversations with all the neighbors on their block to find out what are their interests, what are their skills, what are their needs. And then they create a database, and they bring people together around shared interests. People who have a shared issue can band together to fight City Hall. People who have a shared interest in knitting or in gardening might form a community garden. So they bring people together around shared interests to build community. This is a model that's taken off all over Canada. And we actually use it in Seattle now in our South Park neighborhood. This is in Rotterdam. Rotterdam is largely immigrant and refugee communities. And there was one block there called Opzumer Street where the neighbors had come together and they had regular meetings with city officials to complain about their issues. They had a huge issue with public safety, and the other was with the cleanliness of the street. They had meeting after meeting after meeting, and nothing ever happened. Finally, one of the neighbors said, instead of spending all our time trying to get the city to take care of this, why don't we just do it ourselves? We're actually in a better position to create safety and cleanliness in our block. So they organized, and they do that. And they created a movement now where blocks all over Rotterdam, just about every block in Rotterdam is self-organized around what's important to the neighbors. They organized to take care of latchkey kids, frail elders, to keep the block clean, to teach each other Dutch. And then that if you have at least 4 events a year on your block, you get to put up the symbol saying you're part of the Op-Zoomer Street movement. And then they have discussions at each block level where the neighbors come together and talk about what are the values by which we're going to care for each other on this block. What are we going to do together as a community? Does anybody here know Dutch? Well, I think I kind of remember it. This one says we're going to welcome people into our block. We're going to support the kids on our block. We're going to organize neighborhood activities. We're going to keep our block clean. But the sign looks different on each block because it's something the neighbors come up with. But it's a great way to kind of remind neighbors about the commitments they made to one another. On my street, all the neighbors came together and we talked about what are the values by which we're going to care for the earth, care for our kids, care for one another. And we wrote it up, and it was called the Mead Street Manifesto. And everybody in the street signed it. Having block parties, great way to build community. This is in the UK where all the blocks have one party in the same day. This is also something that started in England, and I think Vancouver, other cities have picked it up, but closing the road not just for parties, but one day a week to have play in the streets, like we used to, where kids just can, the whole family can play in the street, and the streets closed for other activities. But taking the streets back for the people. Here's another example. This is in Portland. And they had an intersection that was kind of dangerous. So they said, we're going to take this back. And without asking any permission from local government, they just painted the intersection and to show pride in their neighborhood, but also really slow down the traffic. And then they created street furniture at the intersection to create kind of that bumping place where neighbors could come together. They have a bench. They have a tea station where somebody takes turns each day filling up the pot with hot water. And neighbors can just stand around and drink tea together. Little free libraries popping up all over the place, but just a great way to connect neighbors. I'm sure there's some here. This is one library for kids' books, one for adults' books. But just the way it brings, it's an excuse to bring people and help connect people together. I was in Kitchener, and they created 50 little free libraries in one day. Put them up all over the city. And then they moved on, create little free art galleries. This is where my dad lives, in a retirement community, and they have little free puzzles. You know, you work a puzzle once or twice, and you get bored with it, and you want a new puzzle, so it's a great way to exchange those. This is in the Wedgwood neighborhood of Seattle, where a mother and her son with disabilities pulls a red fire wagon through the neighborhood, take it door to door, and people can get their choice of magazines that they want to read, and then they leave their leftover magazines, the magazines they've already read, so somebody else can read them. It's a great way to recycle the material, great way, again, to make connections. Planting street trees, creating community gardens on a vacant lot in the neighborhood. Here they put up display boards to show what's special about each family. They have one in front of each house to show what's special about that family. In Waterloo, they have a lot of houses with front porches, so they have front porch concerts. I went up and down the street one day, saw 22 bands play on 11 different porches in one afternoon. And neighbors gather on the lawn. Again, music is a great way to connect people. In Australia, they do welcome dinners. So when somebody new moves into the street, they have a dinner to welcome them and to start to build relationships right from the start. So here's all the things, just a partial list of all the things you could do just on your street, on your block, on the floor of your condo or apartment building. Second key to starting where people are is to start with their bumping places. So oftentimes we're trying to get everybody to come to us, to come to our venue, whether it's a church, a community center, whatever it is, and we wonder why people don't show up. If we really want to get people engaged, we need to figure out where do they bump, where do they hang out, and go to them rather than always trying to get people to come to us. So that bumping place might be the bus stop. It might be the skate park. It might be the playground. In Edmonton, in Alberta, on 118th Street and Alberta Avenue, where they had all kinds of boarded up buildings, the community came together and created their own community cafe called The Carrot. And they have artwork in there done by neighbors. They have musicians from the neighborhood, but it's just become a fantastic bumping place. If you're going to build community, you need places to bump, right? This is a community garden where they create a barbecue area, and they have regular potlucks in the neighborhood. Senior centers is an important bumping place. A cultural center is an important bumping place. Again, go where the people are. Don't always try to get them to come to you. The library is a place where people from all walks of life come together, right? You get homeless people, you get business people, you get young people, old people, but oftentimes they don't connect with each other there. You got all this very inclusive place, but people aren't connecting. Some libraries have taken that on and done things like created a living library where you can go into the library and check out a person who's different from you. Might be a refugee, might be somebody who's experiencing homelessness, and just get to hear their story, get to meet them, build a relationship. This is in Occidental Park and Pioneer Square, which was people were all complaining about because that's where all the people without homes were hanging out, and people felt nervous going in. Said, rather than drive everybody out, let's figure out how we bring everybody in and create a whole set of activities where there's table tennis, where there's basketball court, where there's children's activities, where there's a library, where there's food trucks, where there's tables, and people. You find people there connecting with people who are different than themselves. This is in Newcastle, New South Wales. Just in a neighborhood, people didn't know each other. There was a grass area, but it wasn't a bumping place because there's nothing there to connect people. One of the neighbors had an idea and says, why don't we renaturalize this with native plants and create a bumping space? And we'll put a table in so people can connect and eat together and get to know one another. We'll have some community events there. But a year later, I was visiting. They had these kangaroo paws that had grown up. I looked up in the tree, and there were these tawny frogmouse, the weirdest birds I've ever seen, right in the middle of Newcastle because they brought in these native plants. But the coolest thing was this guy in the center is a Vietnam War veteran. He had some mental health issues as a result. Never came out of his house. But when he saw the neighbors out there revegetating, he came out and said, can I help? And now he is the leader on the project. And it was so great to see how people looked up to him, how they respected him, how they loved him, because they found a way to work together. This is a bumping place in Seattle, downtown Seattle, Westlake Park. And we were trying to get people to focus on issues of racism. We found the same people are always showing up to our workshops. We said, rather than trying to get people to come to us, let's go to them. So let's go to Westlake Mall. So we went to Westlake Mall. We blew up this gigantic elephant. And obviously the issue was racism is the elephant in the room. And then as people were headed to work, as people were headed to shop, we invited people to sit down and talk about race. And involve people who would never, ever, ever, ever come to a workshop on racism. If we want to get people engaged, we need to start where they're at. Third key to starting where people are is to start with their language and culture. When I was doing community organizing in Rainier Valley, southeast Seattle, very diverse neighborhood, I was really clear I often need an interpreter or a translator because it's a very diverse neighborhood. But even if everybody's speaking English, we need to be clear we're speaking the same English that they're speaking. And oftentimes we use our fancy terms like resilience and what are some of the other, carbon-free, and people don't know what we're talking about, right? Sustainability, I talk about asset-based community development, ABCD. People don't know what we're talking about. We need to use language that people are familiar with. Otherwise, they aren't going to know what we're talking about. They aren't going to be comfortable because they don't feel like they have the expertise. And to start with their culture. So this is what we did in my neighborhood, Columbia City. Very diverse neighborhood. And we didn't even all speak the same language, but we all love to dance. So volunteers in the community organized a World Dance Party at the Filipino Community Center. And that first dance party, we had people show up from 12 different cultures teaching each other their dance. God, we had the best time. People were there from all ages, all different cultures. We had so much fun that now we do it all the time. This older woman to this little girl. She was our DJ. But look how it brings people together, and how how many of these people show up to a meeting, right? fun is a way to build community, starting where people are. Fourth part is starting where people are is to start with their networks. Oftentimes we're trying to get people to join our group. Might be the neighborhood association, right? And wonder, God, people are apathetic. They won't join our group. What we forget is that there are hundreds of groups in every neighborhood, both formal and informal. Just about everybody's involved in some kind of group. And if we really want to get people engaged, we need to reach out to all those different groups, find out what groups they're part of, particularly think who's underrepresented in our work and what network are they a part of, right? You gave a great example about working with the local church and working with, with the different networks in your community, something you couldn't have done just by yourself. So on Vashon Island, we wanted to reorganize our neighborhood association, kind of fallen apart. And we realized we don't want to create yet another group because there's hundreds of groups on the island. Let's use the association as a way to bring all those groups together. So we try to figure out what are all the key networks in our community. Well, we have a whole lot of musicians groups. We have a lot of art groups. We have a lot of business groups. We have senior groups. We have youth groups. We have environmental groups. And so what we did is said we're going to have somebody from each of those networks who's responsible for working with all the networks within their sphere, be a representative on the community council so that we can hear from everybody in the island and mobilize everybody when we need to. Really powerful. This is in the Netherlands, the Deventer, very poor, low-income neighborhood of Voorstad. And their neighborhood association was trying to figure out how to work with all the different networks. And one of the key networks was a knitting group. And they thought, well, how do we involve the knitting group in neighborhood issues? But they contacted them, and these guys had a great idea. They said, what we really love about our neighborhood is the Go Ahead Eagles, which is their local football team, professional football team, and that's where their stadium is in Voorstad. So they said, we're going to knit scarves in the red and yellow colors of the Go Ahead Eagles. So here they are knitting the scarves to get pride in our neighborhood. Here's my friend Joop Hoffman wearing one of the scarves at the football game. And then it started catching on, and more people got involved in this. And now they have a whole section of the stadium where they're knitting scarves for the Go Ahead Eagles. And they got so many scarves now, they started knitting them together to make a long scarf. And now at halftime of the Go Ahead Eagle games, they parade this scarf around that's getting larger and larger and larger. And then they started covering all their monuments and churches and town hall with the scarves. And then they covered a whole house with the scarves. And the reason they picked this house, it's the home of Syrian refugees. And they wanted to show the warmth that they had for this family. And then they met their goal. And their goal was to have a scarf that was so large that it could go all the way around their 5-kilometer round neighborhood. And here you can see it's stringing across the utility poles all the way around the neighborhood. 5 kilometers of scarf. And it probably seems kind of frivolous. Here's a low-income neighborhood, and they're making scarves. But I tell you, the way it built connections, the way it built pride, a common sense of identity, the way it built relationships, that's what it's all about. And then the fifth is to start with their passions. So oftentimes we start with what we're passionate about, with our agenda. We try to get people to join our cause. And then we wonder why people don't get involved. We say, boy, people are really apathetic, right? Nobody is apathetic. Everybody cares deeply about something. Now, some people are feeling powerless, but nobody's apathetic. So if you want to get people involved, you need to find out what they care most deeply about. They're much more likely to get involved if you identify something they care about than if you try to sell what you care about, right? So on Vashon, we had a big gathering about how to create inclusive community. Come up with your ideas. And somebody was passionate about pulling elders and young people together for a common soup night once a week. Somebody else was passionate about creating a place around recognizing everybody's abilities in the high school rather than focusing on everybody's disabilities. One project after another, people stood up and championed their own idea and then tried to get people to join them. And people voted with their feet and joined the group of most interest to them. Start where the people are. And then finally, start with their call. I learned this from a friend who is a duck hunter. And he taught me that every duck will respond to a call. There's just a different call for every duck. Right? I was down at Rifle Migratory Bird Center yesterday, so I saw all these different kinds of ducks. There was the wood ducks, and there were the mergansers, and there were the mallards. Every duck will respond to a call. It's just every duck has its own call. And my friend, the duck hunter, taught me, he says, too oftentimes the only call we use is the loon call. And we wonder why only loons come to our meetings. He said, you get what you call. And too oftentimes the only call we use is the meeting call. I didn't say the mating call. Mating call would be kind of interesting, right? But the meeting call. And for a lot of people, that is the worst call in the world. People know they come to that first meeting, they're going to be in the sign-up sheet and sentenced to meetings for the rest of their lives. And a lot of people don't see results from meetings. One meeting just leads to another meeting, leads to another meeting. Nothing ever happens. So if you really want to get people involved, you need to start with their call. And oftentimes it's a social call. People will come out for food. They'll come out for music. They'll come out for fun. And we shouldn't apologize because the purpose isn't who can endure the most suffering. Right? The purpose is to build relationships. And you do that a lot more through fun than you can through meetings. Right? Or the project call. We're just making a short-term commitment using your skills to actually see something happen in your neighborhood. Third key is lead by stepping back. I think everybody here probably knows those people who are complaining that nobody will join them. I'm doing everything. I'm getting burned out as a community leader, and nobody will help me. Well, oftentimes they're their own worst problem because they don't think anybody else can do it quite as well as they can, so they're afraid to let go of anything too, right? And to recognize that nobody has all the skills to be a good leader, right? We need everybody. So it's about more collective leadership. The iron rule of organizing is never do for people what they can do for themselves. And when the best leader's work is done, the people will say, we did it ourselves. If it's just a person or two doing it, it's not community. It's just a person or two. So it's about how do we get everybody engaged. So it's really about community. And finally, don't sit on your assets. Okay. And the point here is that too oftentimes we focus on this map of our neighborhoods and our communities. These are the maps that tend to be created by agencies, well-meaning agencies who do needs assessments to figure out what are all the problems in the neighborhood. How can we be the most helpful? The problem is they often stop there and forget about this map of exactly the same place, which are all the strengths of the community. And this is the basis for community action. I showed a picture of John McKnight. He said when he did organizing, this was always his picture of the neighborhood he was organizing in. They identify all the issues, and then they go to City Hall to make their demands, right? He said once we went to City Hall to make our demands and found out they were bankrupt. They had no money to respond. He said, I need to figure out a new way of bringing people together. And his idea became, rather than organizing people around what they don't have, how about if we organize people around what they do have? And he called that idea asset-based community development. And he created this map of exactly the same place. But instead of focusing on what's wrong, you focus on what's strong. He and his colleague, Jody Cressman, did a survey of 200 communities across North America and found the communities that were the most successful with their community development started not with that needs map, but started with the asset map. Why do you think this might be a better place to start with your community work? Any thoughts? Yeah, exactly. No negativity. I said before, some people go with negativity, but most people get involved because they have hope. They're positive. That's how you make change. Great. That's great. Gives you a reason for hope because you're looking at what's there. What else?
It's strength-based?
Yeah, it's strength-based. You've identified all the things you can do to move forward. You don't have to wait for a grant. You can just do it because you've got all these resources in the community. You don't have to wait for permission from city officials. You can just do it because you got the resources. It's empowering. With the other one, you're always dependent on somebody on the outside to support. With this, you can just take action. What else? Yeah.
See what you actually have.
Yeah.
Figure out what you need from what you have.
Yeah, that's great. It's not like we don't need services of professionals. But the first place to start is with what we have, and then turn to professionals for what. That's perfect. That's great. What was it? The Cody Institute. Oh, they have a great quote. You said it really well, though. What else? If you look at this map, everything ties together, because that's the way our communities are. People belong to multiple networks. There's relationships across networks. When you look at the other map, everything's in its own box, because that's how agencies organize. So you get a much more holistic perspective from this one. All kinds of reasons why this is most effective. Yeah?
Friends, because friends know other people.
Yeah, excellent. That's right. And you see people here as friends and neighbors, rather than as having those labels.
You become creative. You become creative.
Yeah, you become creative. Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, and you build on what's special about your place, about your culture. When solutions come from the outside, it tends to be cookie cutter, right? So here's the resources that every community has. I don't have time to get into every one. I think they're pretty self-explanatory, but all of these are underutilized in our neighborhoods. There's all kinds of underutilized resources. The gifts of individuals, the community associations that tend to not be very networked, so we're losing a lot of their power. Agencies that all have underutilized resources because they focus their resources on their narrow mission to the extent they aren't needed for their mission, they go underutilized. I figured out our schools once in Seattle are used about 18% of the time because their mission is to educate young people. How many factories could afford to operate their physical plant 18% of the time? So we opened up our school at night for community use, right? So all kinds of resources going underutilized. Built natural environment, our local economy, our local history, culture, and identity. But the most important asset is that first one. Every individual has gifts of the head, heart, and hands. Gifts of the head, their knowledge. Gifts of the heart, their passions. And gifts of the hands, their skills. Absolutely, everybody has these. And to prove it, what I'd like you to do is to interview somebody else in the room for 3 minutes to find out what their gifts are. Okay? And then have that person interview you for 3 minutes to find out what your gifts are. And what I want you to do is to move around, because you guys, we want to practice what we've been talking about, building community, building inclusive community. So I don't want you just talking to the people you talk to all the time. Find somebody you don't know. This is a chance to build some relationships, get to know somebody. 3 minutes. I know people in Canada are very modest. You don't like to talk about your gifts, but just do it for me, okay? 3 minutes. So again, yeah. Gifts of, I forgot this whole story, but we don't have time for it anyhow. So identify your skills, knowledge, and passions. Just make a quick list of some of the key things. Are you passionate about, do you love to play music? You might not necessarily be really skilled at it, but you enjoy it, right? Or you're a cook, or you're fix cars, or you know about the solar system, or you know the history of your neighborhood. What you're passionate about social justice, or you're passionate about the environment, or you're passionate about a local football team, whatever, okay? Do it, man, move around. You've been sitting for too long. quick, because we want to make sure both of you have a chance to share your gifts. Discussion going on. I really appreciate you connecting with other people and being actively engaged. A great conversation, so thank you. We could have gone all night just identifying all the gifts in this room. Sorry, just give you 3 minutes. Love to hear some examples. What are some of the gifts you uncovered? Just real quick. Some of the gifts you uncovered. What did you hear when you interviewed somebody else?
Bonnie here was curious, so those would have been
Great.
gifts.
That's great. That's a great gift.
So connecting people and being friendly and outgoing.
That's great. Fantastic.
I chat with Candy, and Candy's really caring about people, and she wants to be in a position where she can care and be part of family. She doesn't have a family of her own.
Oh, okay, great.
She wants to be part of other people.
Dynamite. That's great. Others? Yeah.
Passion for ownership of advocacy for disabilities.
Great. That's great. Others?
Barb's passionate about advocacy, especially with disability rights as well, right?
Dynamite. What about other things? Do people here who like to fish, or people like to play music, or
Like the talk.
people like to cook? What else do we have? Yeah, okay, I like to eat fish. I have a passion for that too. I had great sushi today. That was awesome. Yeah, it was so good. What else? So what I'd like you to think about is how you could use all these gifts to build community. But too oftentimes in our community work, we're looking for a very narrow set of gifts. Maybe just the advocacy, maybe just the good talker, and forget about the good listener, which is probably more important. We're looking for the good grant writer. We forget about the person who could write the stories about what the community's accomplishing. It could be a lot more powerful in terms of doing our community work. How the musician and the artist, the woodworker, the bicycle repair person, the person who's passionate about the history of their place, the person who knows the ecology of the place, how all those could be used to do really powerful community work. Really powerful. But we often miss out on it because we label so many people in our community not by their gifts, but by what they're missing. So what are some labels we put on huge sections of our community that basically deny their gifts by focusing, like we did with that neighborhood needs map, focusing on their needs rather than on their gifts? What are some? Addict, good one. Yeah. And how are they going to deal with their addiction if all we do is focus on their addiction, right? Rather than all their other gifts. What else? Seniors. Oh, I get increasingly sensitive to that one. Yeah. Old people, washed up. Yeah. And yeah, who's got more life experience, more knowledge, more wisdom to pass on? Who's got more time, right? All kinds of professional skills they've gained throughout their lives, and all of a sudden they retire, and it's like they're worthless. Oh, incredible resource. What else? Unhoused people. Yeah. I got a story about that in a few minutes, where we define people we define them by what they're missing, a house. And forget about all the other aspects of that person. What else?
Young people.
Yeah, oftentimes We don't talk about young people without the adjective at risk, right? And there's some truth to it. I mean, young people are at risk. We're all at risk, right? But if you take off that label, who's got more energy? Who's got more at stake in the future of our community? Who understands technology better than young people? Who's more creative than young people? Who are the experts on young people more than young people, right? And we all old people sit around talking about, what are we going to do about the youth problem, right? Our problem is we aren't engaged in the gifts of young people. What are some of the other labels? Oh, that's good. So, here's a few more I put up. Non-English speaking, unemployed, poor person, single parent, offender, and we go on and on and on, where we define people by what they're missing. And when we just, shut in, good. And the more we define people by what they need, they become clients in a service system. We've defined them out of community because the basis for community is sharing our gifts. And if we don't acknowledge people's gifts, they aren't part of our community. And I'm not denying that people have needs. Everybody in this room has some needs, right? Mine's my memory. It gets worse all the time. But I don't say I have a terrible memory problem, please hire me. I try to think of some gifts I have. And yet there's a huge section of most people in our population we define solely in terms of their needs, right? So the basis for building community is to take off that label and focus on everybody's gifts, right? Yeah.
Jim, if you don't mind, I just love the gifts concept. And one of the things that we forget is, like, let's say someone is a gift of kindness or generosity or a friendliness. And then we need to say, well, where can that gift of generosity, friendliness, outgoingness, where can it be used? Where can it help others? Where can it connect? Yeah. Sometimes we say, oh, those are nice gifts. We don't figure out how they could be used.
Yeah, no, you're right. And those are some of the most powerful gifts. People talked about just, the person said, I want to care for people, but I don't have family, so I want to care for others. Boy, that is powerful. That is really powerful.
So where can she give that gift?
Yeah. So, thanks. That's really good. So here's some examples about sort of lifting off those labels and focusing on people's gifts. People talked about homeless. I have a friend, Damon Lynch, who's a minister at church in New Prospect Baptist Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. And the members of his church operate a soup kitchen in the basement for homeless men. And finally, one of the members of the church got this idea and says, why don't we interview these men, find out what their gifts are? Turns out a whole bunch of these men like to cook. They said, would you like to help cook the meals in the soup kitchen? They were overjoyed. Nobody ever thought to ask them that before. And after a while, the homeless men and the members of the church are cooking and eating together. It's kind of hard to tell who are the providers and who are the clients, because it wasn't about services anymore. It's about community. That's what community is all about, recognizing we all have needs and we all have gifts, and it's about supporting each other's needs with each other's gifts. One of the categories, there was a study done by United Way of Canada at one point, and they found that 90% of the people who volunteered for United Way said that they volunteered because somebody asked them to contribute their gifts. So I would argue just about everybody's gifts we're missing out on. And the key is to be in relationship with people. If you know somebody, know what their gifts are, and ask them to be engaged, they're much more likely to get engaged than if you just put notices in the newspaper or put it online. It's that personal relationship. Sort of a sidetrack, but important. Non-English speaking is another one. Disabled. Drives me crazy. Where we define people in terms of their disability rather than their ability. So just a few stories from Seattle. We tried to figure out how do we create more inclusive neighborhood associations. So we formed a group called the ACT Team, made up of neighborhood leaders who wanted to create more inclusive organizations and individuals with disabilities who wanted to be included. And it wasn't just a task force, it was a group to actually actively work to make matches. So this is Matt. Matt and his mom came to see me, and Matt says, I've been living in the Ravenna neighborhood now for 8 years. I don't know anybody. I'm really lonely. And I said, Matt, what do you care about in your neighborhood? And he took me to Ravenna Creek. He said, I love the creek. I knew that the neighborhood association was working hard to clean up the creek to make it better salmon habitat. So I talked to Thomas, who was head of the association. I said, Thomas, could you involve Matt in your project? He said, yeah, we can always use more volunteers. So they trained Matt how to remove the invasive plants and how to reforest with native plants. Matt became the expert. He started leading the work parties, teaching everybody else how to remove the invasives and how to reforest with native plants. But Matt's greatest gift is he's totally socially uninhibited. He'll go and knock on every door in the neighborhood trying to recruit more volunteers to help with this party. And he knocks on your door. He says, hi, I'm Matt. I really care about the salmon, don't you? You're going to help me, aren't you? You can't say no to Matt. He is the #1 volunteer recruiter in the neighborhood. He's got armies of people cleaning out those invasive plants. And he's really creative. At Christmas time, he organizes a holly day party. He gets people to take that invasive holly and make Christmas decorations. And then he invites everybody back to his house afterwards for a party. And as I said, he's always the first one out on the dance floor. He helps everybody else break out of their shells. That's his gift. He builds community like nobody else. It's that care you talked about, right? But we're missing out on it because he had that label. He was part of the disability community. This is Susan on the right-hand side. She was chair of the Westwood Neighborhood Association. She wanted to create a more inclusive association. So she put notices out in the neighborhood looking for people who wanted to be connected in their community. She got a call from Raymond and Ginger. She went to their house. They said, we've been living here 20 years. We don't know our neighbors. She looked around the inside walls of that house and saw all these crafts on the walls. And she said, what's with the crafts? They said, that's how we spend our time. And a lot of the crafts had clown themes. And she said, what's with the clown? And Ginger said, Raymond used to be Rayto the Clown, but he hasn't clowned in 20 years. Susan said, we're having our Delridge Neighborhood Festival on Saturday. Could you come down and do some clowning for us? He was overjoyed. Saturday morning, he came and picked up Ginger and Raymond, and Rayto the Clown was the hit of the festival. The kids absolutely loved him. Started inviting him to kids' birthday parties, other community events. But in the process, he and Ginger met other people who did craft work. They started getting rides to craft shows. They made some income from that. But more importantly, they built lots of relationships. Susan said they opened doors for her in the neighborhood like nobody else had been able to. Finally, here's Larry. Larry has a disability that makes him totally dependent on public transit. So he knows the bus system better than anybody else in his Capitol Hill neighborhood. He knows all the places the bus goes. He knows all the places the bus should go, but doesn't go. He knows where there should be covered bus shelters, where there should be better security lighting. So when the neighborhood did their neighborhood plan, they tapped Larry to help with the transportation element. Larry became so highly valued, he was elected vice chair of the Capitol Hill Community Council. Somebody with disabilities, somebody who's been seen as a person with nothing but needs, is now a leader in his community because people thought to lift off that label. So this isn't just about how do we help those poor individuals with disabilities. It's about how do we use all the gifts in our community to do this powerful community work and make real change. Old people. It's a story from Adelaide. Barb told me the story. She's a social worker. She told me the story of Colleen. Colleen's an older woman who was totally depressed, and depressed for good reason because she'd lost her husband and her best friend and her dog. There was nobody left who she thought cared about her or who she felt a deep connection with. So she'd just given up. She was laying in bed day after day, depressed. One day, Barb came to see her and saw this knitting by the side of her bed and said, what's that? She said, well, it's a tea cozy. I made it years ago. And Barb knew there was a new upscale tea shop going in Adelaide, so she talked to the owners and said, do you think you could sell some of these? The owner said, oh my God, we've been looking all over for good tea cozies. Yeah, we could sell those. So she went back and told Colleen. Colleen got a little bit excited. She started making more and more tea cozies. They started flying off the shelf of the tea shop. She couldn't keep up with demand. So she reached out to other older women who were in the same situation. They formed the Cozy Club. And she taught them how to make tea cozies. They didn't need the proceeds from these tea cozies, so they used all the proceeds to support an association of women with acquired brain injuries. They made more and more tea cozies. They also made wonderful fabric wall hangings like this one showing a winery right outside of Adelaide. I was back in Adelaide a few years ago. I was back in the same neighborhood. I ran into Barb walking down the street. She came running up to me and said, "Jim, we bought this old caravan, a trailer. And now we have it at the men's shed, and we're getting it outfitted with a handle and a spout." And they pull this tea wagon through the streets, and they stop in the neighborhood, and inside they have the capacity to make tea. And so the neighbors gather around, they serve them tea, and they talk about, well, what can we do to make our neighborhood a better place? And as they're drinking tea and talking, they're also knitting. And they've knit a gigantic tea cozy that now surrounds this trailer that they call Colleen. So I have zillions of stories about just lift off those labels. Focus on everybody's gifts. And so many of us have adopted those labels, right? We've taken on, like our neighborhood is seen as a place with needs, so we're a needy neighborhood, and we're looking to the city for all the support, or, I'm homeless, or I'm poor, and so we're just focusing on what we're missing. So it's also helping people rediscover their gifts and reminding people that they can make a contribution to their community. And finally, to celebrate success and recognize caring neighbors. I did regular walking tours with the mayor in neighborhoods, so we could see firsthand what some of the problems were, what some of the improvements were, hear from the neighbors. And we went to the Finney neighborhood once, and one of the residents gave the mayor a letter, and he read it in the car on the way back to City Hall. Read it out loud and started getting teary-eyed. And the letter basically said, "I am so angry at the Seattle Times, our local newspaper, because they're always writing stories about bad neighbors. They just wrote one about neighbors fighting over a fence. And they know it sells, so they just said, we'd love to hear more stories about bad neighbors. We're going to have a regular column called Neighbors from Hell." She said, "I'm so tired of the local media because they're always focusing on the negative. That's not why I live in my neighborhood. I live in my neighborhood because I have great neighbors. But those stories are never in the media. So people get a really skewed sense about their community. I want to have one day a year where we can recognize caring neighbors. And I'd like to do it in the dead of winter when people are the least connected. Let's have a neighbor appreciation day." And I said, and the mayor said, "Okay, we're going to make it happen." And he told me, "Jim, make it happen." I said, "What a stupid idea, another made-up holiday, So I wrote a resolution for the mayor, and it basically said the first Saturday before Valentine's Day was going to be Neighbor Appreciation Day, and we encouraged neighbors to just come together and recognize good works by fellow neighbors. So it wasn't taking any responsibility for the city. It was just, declaring an official day where people had permission to go and talk to their neighbors. It's really weird these days. You almost need permission, right? People came out of the woodwork. On Neighbor Appreciation Day, I would go to as many as 24 events in a day, starting with breakfast and ending with a wine event at night. All day long, people were doing celebrations, recognizing people, giving them awards, giving certificates. Every neighborhood found different ways to do it. A local insurance company had a greeting card contest, and in the school they had kids depict pictures of caring neighbors. And the winner got printed on a greeting card that we made available for free in our little city halls. Thousands of them would fly off the shelves each year. And inside just says, "Thank you, neighbor." And you take it to your neighbor and say, "Hey, thank you for watching my kids after school. Hey, thank you for watering my garden while I was on vacation." Just recognizing those things that make our communities work. And it really took off. More neighbors started thinking about, how can we be better neighbors? So I just wanted to end by saying how important it is to celebrate success, that oftentimes we're just running from one project to the next, one issue to the next. And we need to take time to celebrate the gains that we make, to celebrate the people who make it possible. We all like to think, I really don't need to be recognized, but people love it. And the more we can recognize people, the more it gets other people to step up and recognize this is how it happened, because some of my neighbors stepped up. It didn't happen out of the blue. It was community that made these things happen. So I just wanted to end on that note because I wanted to end by thanking you. You spent 2 hours with me tonight. I know that's precious time. I know you're here because you care deeply about your community and are looking for ways to get more people engaged. So I really can't think of any work that's more important than what you're doing. There's nothing. It's the key to everything we care about. It really is. So I just want to encourage you to keep at it. Hopefully I've shared some strategies about how do you build this movement. And I also hope I've shared a little bit of hope, because I've shared stories from all over the world, and I tell you, the same thing's happening everywhere. Oftentimes we're working hard in our own communities, and we think, this is kind of cute, it's kind of nice, but what difference am I making? Well, we're having, countries at war, and we're having climate change, and all these big picture things. But I swear, you're part of a global movement, and together we're making massive change. And we really need to step it up right now. So really want to thank you for what you do and encourage you to do even more. And if there's any way I can help along the way, just contact me. I'm Jim Diers at Comcast.net, okay? If you lose that, just see me afterwards. But I really love to hear your stories. If you have questions, whatever, looking for resources, let me know, because I'm really passionate about this. I think it's absolutely critical. And when there's a group like you that shows your interest, I want to come through. I want something to happen, okay? So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Actually, we have 3 minutes if there are any questions.
We want to get a picture afterwards if everyone can move in, but I want to thank you. Like I said at the beginning, I've heard Jim for many, many years, and every time I hear him, he always inspires me.
You can give the talk now.
Yeah. No, you're the expert at it, but just little things you can take back to your neighborhood, whether you live in a complex or, on a street. I recently moved into a new subdivision, and we didn't know our neighbors. We had a clubhouse, and guess what? We put together a little potluck, and several times a year we do that. So simple things. And when things go sideways in a community that you require other people, you know that they're there, and at least you know your neighbors. So I also want to thank Jen Arbo. Jen Arbo did the lion's share of the organizing this committee, this forum. We would like to do more of these in the future, but this was our first time that we've done it. So we're actually going to send out a survey just to get your feedback, and we'd like to continue on. So my hope is that you can share what you've learned today and continue to be inspired, and congratulate you on being here and for the work that you do for our community. Because like Jim says, it starts with the community. It doesn't start with the city. So thank you.
But what an opportunity. I mean, I can't think of many cities that also believe the importance of building community, and to have city government and you on the same page on that, I think is an incredible opportunity. So make the most of it.